Good morning. Welcome again to Tactical Edge Virtual Summit. Today, Wednesday, is our third day. We have fantastic speakers. We are with Andy Ellis and with our director, with Edgar Rojas. Ed, how are you today?
I am exhausted. This is the beginning of the third day, and yeah, I'm already exhausted. We had some amazing speakers in the past 2 days, and then we start today with, one of the smartest people that I really have a pleasure of meeting, Andy Ellis. So thank you so much, Andy, for being here with us. Wonder what's happening. I don't see the presentation starting here in the platform.
Well, that's always a concern, Edgar. You might have had too much aguardiente at the speaker dinner last night. Maybe some coca tea will help wake you up.
Maybe to drink coffee. Do you have your coffee already?
I have my coffee already. Drank it. No, but
I have my water.
We're on. So it's my. You have your water. Perfect. So again, thank you very much, Andy, for being here with us. Before we start again, let me just make sure that I have an opportunity to thank our wonderful sponsors, Ativo Networks, SailPoint, Exabeam, and CyberArk. Without them, there's the reason why we are able to offer, this event free of charge. And it's not easy, and it's a lot of time, a lot of effort. And so I really appreciate if everyone visits their virtual booths today and the rest of the week. They have a lot of really good videos there. They're not too long. They're like 7 to 15 minutes long, which is digestible, and a lot of really good information to download and to learn from.
Exactly. It's totally worth it. We invite you to go and visit our sponsors, and of course, they have special activities for you. So go and visit them, please.
So, Salma, who do we have today with us?
Well, we have Andy Ellis. Thank you so much for being with us. Andy Ellis is Akamai's Chief Security Officer, and his mission is making the internet suck less. Andy is graduated of MIT with a degree in computer science and has served as an officer in the United States Air Force with the 609th Information Warfare Squadron and the Electronic Systems Center.
Yeah.
Really interesting. Andy, thank you so much for being with us. And of course, I know because Ed told me you went to Colombia 2 years ago. How was that experience?
It was fantastic. I'd been Colombia once before. I'd been in Cali. That was in Bogota. So it's fascinating to sort of see two different aspects of the country. In addition to getting to participate in Tactical Edge, also got to see a lot of the city. Edgar took us around, a lot of walking at that altitude, to see the palace and to see El Museo del Oro, where I picked up my copy of the Balsamuisca, the El Dorado raft, for those who are not familiar with it.
That is amazing, really. Yeah, you went to Bogota, capital city. Wow, that's wonderful, actually.
Yeah, and I remember, do a lot of walking, and being from Colombia, it doesn't affect me, and obviously it affected a lot of them, and because it's very high altitude. And one thing about Andy that a lot of us know is he's a die-hard Patriots fan. I really want to ask you, really, what are your feelings right now with no more Brady and a new quarterback? How's that?
I think the Patriots were blessed. 20 years with a Hall of Fame quarterback. That just doesn't happen. 20 years, right? That's basically was his tenure. And so we've forgotten that football is a business, right? Players leave and they move and they go somewhere else. And so he's chosen to go somewhere else. And, I'm rooting for him in Tampa Bay. My dream is that Brady's final pass this season is in the Super Bowl and it goes for a touchdown, but it's caught by Stephon Gilmore as the Patriots defeat Tampa Bay. Like, that would be ideal. But I can just wish for that in a fantasy, because I'm not even sure there's going to be a season right now. I think, with what we're seeing with other sports, unless you put yourself in a bubble, it's not clear that you're going to be able to have a full season.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised when we were talking on Monday with Helen Patton, at Ohio State, or the Ohio State University, when she said that they canceled the college season. And I'm like, oh, how do you cancel college football? I mean, that's
right. Some of the conferences are canceling, some are pushing to spring, and now we're waiting to see if the NFL will adjust their 2021 calendar to accommodate a spring college football season. But I think a lot of this ties into this concept of how do you make decisions when the world has changed so dramatically from how you're used to making decisions, which conveniently is what I'm about to talk about.
Exactly. Yeah. So what is your presentation about, Andy, today?
So today we're going to talk a little bit about how humans make decisions, and then looking at that through the lens of uncertainty. Normally when people are making decisions, we make them and we understand the world around us and we know the consequences of our decision. So when your child comes in and they need a new Zoom link, right? You understand sort of what you're doing at this point. But if your child comes in and they're on fire, that's a very different situation that you might react a little differently about. And we're now in a world where every decision we're making is colored by coronavirus, which changes the calculus that we're going through.
You're right. Welcome again, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Salma. I appreciate it. And we'll start our sharing.
Okay.
So
we see it.
We're going to talk about human decision making in this era of coronavirus. And when I talk about the era of coronavirus, we're really going to look at this model of not being able to understand what's going on in the world. And to start with, I want to throw the results of a poll I did on Twitter up. I asked people two different questions. I said, how would you feel about these two statements? And one is, my kids are going to sleepaway camp this summer, next week. And one is, my kids are going to tent away camp next week. Now, before you worry too much about the specific details of these numbers, this is not a scientific survey. This was done on Twitter, two different questions, different set of respondents. More than twice as many people answered one as answered the other one. So I'm not trying to draw scientific conclusions here. But what's fascinating is how many people became curious with this alternate formulation. Because when we said sleepaway camp, strong negative vibe. Still a strong negative vibe on this idea of a tent away camp. But what changes here is this idea that tent away isn't a word people have seen before. They might have a visual for it, but sleepaway lets them really understand, oh, I know what you're talking about, and that's just bad. So I'm going to come back to this one in a little bit. But first I want to think a little bit about disaster planning in the before times. So in my tenure at Akamai, I've been here for 20 years now. I've had a lot of jobs. And one of them has been disaster planning and looking at disaster recovery. And when we wrote our plans for our first network operations center, unlike today where we have 3 24/7 operations center around the planet, where we're not really worried about localized disasters, we were doing disaster planning for our location in Cambridge. And we had a backup location at the other end of the city that we could move our staff to. And we had other locations in other cities that we could sort of stand up slowly. And we looked at, for each procedure, what would it take for us to do this procedure? And what we did was we wrote down 4 questions. We said, are our staff okay? Can we use the staff that we would normally have working in the NOC? Can they make it to where our building is? And if they can make it to the building, is the building even open? And even if the building's open, does it have power or internet? Now you might look at those last 3 and go, those are fine nuance there, but we might have equipment in that building that we're going to get for a long-term disaster and move to somewhere else. And it was interesting because we had this model for a couple of years, and one year our auditors looked at it. And every year, if you go through audits or assessments, you'll discover that the same answers cause new questions. Your assessors want to demonstrate value that they're inspecting, or maybe they noticed something they didn't notice before. And they said, there's no disaster scenarios here. Like, you didn't write down what would cause these. Now, from where we were sitting, the number of possible scenarios was significant, but there's only 16 different outcomes they're going to get sorted into. But we sat down, we said, okay, we'll write down some scenarios. What happens if a water main breaks, which has happened to us? what happens if the city of Cambridge loses power, which has happened to us. What happens if there's a terrorist attack near our building, which has happened to us. But there was one interesting one that we didn't have a good answer for, which was, the workers were okay, but they couldn't get to the building, but it was open and working. And, on sort of a whim, because we're late at night trying to satisfy our auditors, we said, that's a zombie uprising. A slow-moving zombie uprising. There's this global pandemic infecting people. You don't want to go outside because you don't want to get it. And we wrote this down 15 years ago, mostly as a joke. But what's interesting is that's basically the process we started to follow when coronavirus happened. Because we had planned for it, and so it wasn't this sort of novel thing that we're trying to make a decision in uncertain times. We actually had a plan that matched the times we were in by happenstance. Now, we've seen this before. When avian flu was spreading, SARS-1, I was also on that planning team. It was a cross-functional team, and one day we got together, and the head of the team, he was our head of real estate, says, I want to do a tabletop today. So imagine that there's a case of SARS just confirmed landed at Boston Logan Airport, where our headquarters was. Or still is. I guess technically it's there even if none of us are there. And I looked up and I said, right, I'm going to tell all of my people to do what I do. And I'm going to get into my car. I'm going to hop on this phone call to talk about planning while I'm in the car, but I'm going to stop at the store on the way home and pick up groceries. And then when I get home, I'll be able to do email and phone, and I'll just work from home. And he looked at me and he said, no, we have to make a plan before we leave the building. And I looked at him and I said, we don't need to be together to make a plan. And if this really just happened, we're not going to sit down here and spend 5 hours making a plan. There's a value in fast movement. There's a quote that gets attributed to a long line of generals throughout history. I like General Charles Krulak of the Marine Corps, his formulation that says a 70% plan violently executed will always beat a 100% plan. And that's what this is. This is a 70% plan. Notice that there's a problem and here's what you're going to do about it. We are a knowledge work-based organization. We're not doing things physically in our building. We're not assembling items. We have some staff that do, but that's a tiny minority. For most of us, let's move. Now, let's think about the decision-making process that my brain went through at that moment and what everybody's brain goes through. And if you've seen previous talks that I've given, you're probably familiar with the OODA loop. The OODA loop is a concept coined by Colonel Boyd, United States Air Force. And it basically says when presented with new evidence, you are first going to observe what has happened. You see it. You're going to orient what that means. Decide, think about what that means to you. For him, this was about, you see a fighter jet coming up on your 6. Now you need to decide what to do. Are you going to pull up? Are you going to dive down? And then you act. And all of human decision making can be modeled simply as following this pattern. And now we go through this, every day, many, many times a day, and you do it unconsciously. You don't even think that you're doing this. You don't stop and say, oh, I just saw this thing. Let me think about what that means to you. That happens a little bit and sometimes, but not all the time. And in fact, we don't even observe most of the world. We filter out quite a number of things that come in. In the book, The User Illusion, we talk about something like 11 million bits of information, depending on how you sort of calculate them, coming into the human body every second. And yet we can only think about and process, maybe, a handful of concepts, 7 to 20 concepts at a time. And so most of that information we're just going to ignore. If you think about it, right now, many of you are sitting in your homes. And before I started this sentence, a lot of you probably weren't thinking about the feel of the chair that's around you. But now you are, because I've drawn your attention to it. Maybe you're one of the people who does always feel it. You have a sensory processing difference like I do. I'm always conscious of the feel of a chair that I'm sitting in. But that can be distracting. So your brain is trying to limit. And some of that limitation is built into your hardware. in the design of the human eyeball allows us to focus on different things. Your peripheral vision is good at tracking movement, but not at fine detail orientation. Things that move really fast, when your eyes are moving, you have saccadic blindness. You literally don't see while your eyes are moving side to side. If you want to test this one, it's fantastic. Go stand in front of a mirror and look to one side, and then without moving your head, just flick your eyeballs to the left and to the right. And notice you never see your eyeballs move because your brain is interpolating from one location to another. Do the same thing with your camera on your phone. Look at yourself in selfie mode and flick your eyes, and now you see your eyes move because the camera adds latency so that blindness goes away. Turns out it's not actually blindness, you're filtering it out. If we give you things that are moving at the same speed as your eyes are flickering from side to side, you'll see those, but you won't see the rest of the world. Fascinating how the human brain and the human body has reoriented itself around how to do observation. But once you do observe a thing, now you need to orient yourself. You have models of the world that you're trying to aggressively pattern match and fit your observations into. When you're driving a car, which I know many of us haven't gotten to drive a car in months, but try to remember what it was like. When you see a pedestrian walking down the road, but they're on the sidewalk, walking in the direction that they ought to be, your brain quickly orients it and says, nothing to worry about here, and moves on. Now, if you see a child chasing a ball that's coming into the street, you now orient yourself. That's a hazard you have to do something about, and so you're going to continue on this loop. But the challenge of orientation is that our models are all simple, and models are always wrong. They're sometimes useful and helpful. In fact, they're mostly useful and helpful. But it's when they're wrong that they can create challenges for us, especially if that wrongness is a subtle wrongness that you don't notice, but it's nonetheless critical. And then, of course, once you've oriented yourself to the world, that allows you to decide what to do. Edgar and I were talking in the warm-ups about how much football I enjoy watching, and I love using the model of a playbook. You think about your decision trees as playbooks. If I see this happening, I will respond in this way. And then that tells you what you'll go do and how you'll act, but it's really I see that the world has presented me with a challenge. I've already have a playbook for what to do about it. And then finally we act, and the ways in which we act are often the ways that we've been trained to act. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and the more you practice with your hammer, the more often you want to pick it up. So we, more often than not, will fall back to actions that we have practiced and understood. So in the case of the conversation I'd had in emergency response planning with SARS vaccine, I had practiced, let's just go home. That was my plan. I do that every time there's weather in Boston. We tell our staff in the winter, and especially if they're their first year here, we say, look, the first day it snows, everybody in Boston becomes a horrible driver. So don't drive, even if it's just a powder. A tiny amount of snow hits the ground, stay home. Because we'd rather have you safe at home. You can mostly work from home. We have now learned that work from home in the pre-COVID times is very different than working from the crisis command center that our homes have become in COVID times, as we're juggling our own work, our spouse working, our children going to school or summer camp, all in one household. These are all things that we have to struggle with. But I want to think about these models for a moment. So if you're not familiar with what I have on screen here, this is what's called Anscombe's quartet. And what's fascinating about these set of data points is that they all fit that blue line. That's its moment. If you think about the distribution, you do a linear fit, this is what they all fall back to. And this is sort of how the human brain works. It has a set of these moments it's going to try to fit data points to. But when we look at it, think about the infelicities that we introduce. This first one in the upper left corner, that one seems like it might be a reasonable fit. It's a scattering of data points that are pretty close to that. The second one in that upper right corner, that's clearly a ball that's been thrown up and it's coming back down, and if we keep planning for it to keep going up, we're going to be sadly disappointed. The third one, down here in the lower left corner, the arm is close but not quite accurate because we have one weird outlier data point. that might be a harbinger of a significant change to come, or might just be a sampling error. We read the world wrong. And this final one, I don't even know how to describe that. Right? This is a set of data that doesn't match a line at all, but we had this one weird outlier data point that we tried to fit in with everything else. So instead of thinking about it separately, we put it together, and we're going to end up with sort of a strange model of the world. Now, this simplifies the concept I'm aiming for you, which is that the human brain is going to oversimplify and it's going to try to pattern match in the world so that it can make fast, efficient decisions. And we just need to recognize when our pattern matching might lead us a little bit astray. But sometimes it helps us out. So let's come back to my original Twitter survey about sleepaway camp and tent-away camp. And I suspect that what happened when people read sleepaway camp, what pops into their head is this other data point. They'd recently seen these news articles about 260 campers at a sleepaway camp who tested positive because there were 14 people to a cabin. And so, of course, one person gets sick, everybody's going to get sick. Or maybe they read about the camp that did take amazing, extraordinary precautions and still ended up with 80 of their campers sick. And so when we see this, we hear the word sleepaway camp, we fit it into the recent news we have, and that orients us to this is a bad decision, and so I'm going to respond negatively. And what's happening there is sometimes very useful. It's an example of historical paranoia, which is we are afraid of things because they match stories we have been told in the past. And when we think about the security world, things like password management rules are often fed by historical paranoia. We tell people to rotate passwords every 90 days. We've told them to do that for the 30 years of my security career because 30 years ago, that's how long it took to crack a password. And yet, we're unlikely to change that guidance until we finally succeed on the multi-factor authentication path and eliminate passwords entirely. And there's some research out of the 1950s that's fascinating, often gets mistold, but the research itself is very interesting about human behavior based on primate behavior. And in this experiment, the researchers took 8 apes and put them individually into a room with a table, and they put a novel object on the table. When the ape went over to investigate the novel object, they sprayed it with an air hose. That's sort of a punishment. Don't do that. Now, the data set for 2 of the apes ends up inconclusive, so they only talk about 6 of them, 3 male, 3 female. And for each of those 6, they bring in a second ape of the same sex as the first ape and put a novel object on the table. They don't spray the monkey, the ape. And all 6 new apes head for it. Now what's interesting is the male apes all stop the other male ape from going over. The female apes do not. We can draw conclusions, positive or negative, in either direction for it. It leads to apocryphal stories about this research as to whether or not, at some point you'd have apes who'd never been sprayed in the room by themselves, and would they stop other apes from going to the novel object. That's often how this research gets retold. That's not what actually happens here. But that retelling sticks with many people because it fits our model of the world. This belief that humans are functionally a cargo cult around risk. That because it has always happened this way, we should just follow that. And in many senses, for the information security industry, that is true. Many of our security standards, ISO 27002, the PCI data security standard, these are all based a list of all of the things that would have protected somebody else at some time in the past. We look at major breaches and we say, if only they had done this thing, and we add it to our standards. In fact, as a vendor, we often get our customers will send us surveys and say, can you answer all of these questions? And many of them are based off ISO 27002 or off of the bit SIG, but they tell us it's been customized. And what customized means is there's 3 to 5 extra questions at the end. And we've determined after a while that those questions were often the questions about the breaches that that company had suffered themselves. That they had found that ISO was insufficient for them. And there was this one other control they wanted to have, and now they want to make sure everybody else has it. So it leaked information about their paranoia. And so we use models of our world, right? We believe these things, and sometimes we do believe it based on research that we've had. The prisoner's dilemma is one of my favorite. It's probably the most common piece of research done in the graduate student environment because it crosses economics as well as psychology and a little bit of cognitive science. And so it gets redone and redone. And for those of you not familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, it's basically the premise behind every police procedural television show you've probably ever seen. At some point you have two people who have engaged in a crime. And these two people have been caught by the police. And the police sort of have enough evidence for a lesser charge. Maybe they robbed a bank and you caught them in a stolen vehicle. So we can get them for grand theft auto, but not for bank robbery. But of course we know that they have robbed the bank. And so we present each of them with a choice. We separate them so they can't conspire against the investigators, and we give them a choice to remain loyal to their partner or to betray them. To betray them by confessing to the crime, implicating their partner, or remain loyal and say nothing. And so we will say, perhaps over to this purple one, we say, look, if you both remain loyal, you will go to jail for 3 years. So your value here is -3, certainly not a positive value. But they're probably going to betray you and confess. And when they do, you're going to jail for 10 years because you were unrepentant. You showed no remorse. Now look, if you betray them and they remain loyal, you're clearly the one who showed remorse. And you'll go to jail for only 1 year, because you've turned state's evidence. But we have to be very honest and say, if both of you betray each other, we don't need each of your testimony to implicate the other, so you'll each go to jail for 5 years. And in fact, we're going to offer your partner, the gray person, the same set of outcomes. Now, what's fascinating about this construction is it contains what's known as a Nash equilibrium, which means that no matter what your partner does, tactically you are better off betraying them. And so both of you should betray each other, and you will end up in this bottom location, -5, -5. Instead of in this place that's clearly superior for both of you, where you remain loyal to each other, -3, -3. And in fact, a lot of research supports that humans, when presented with this choice between loyal and betrayal, only 13% of the time will they remain loyal. And 40% of the time they're going to betray each other. Now, the other 47%, only one of them flips. And this is fascinating research. Now, we should caveat at this point and recognize that almost any research that is done on humans that looks simple and easy to do like this is done on graduate students. Now, graduate students are what are known as a weird population, graduate students in most colleges, which is, by and large, those are Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies that they tend to come from. So they don't necessarily represent human range and diversity. And further, grad schools are odd in another fashion. In many disciplines, the ultimate goal you want is an academic posting. And so your fellow grad students are your competitors for postings that are very, very rare. Maybe 1 in 100 of you will get a professorship, and the rest of you, maybe you're flipping burgers somewhere, or shifting to a new career outside your discipline. So maybe they're not the best proxy for humans, but nonetheless, this informs much of human decision making is this belief that humans betray each other. At least it did, until some researchers in Australia said, well, if we can do this experiment on grad students, where we're offering them free meals, why don't we do this experiment on actual prisoners? And so engaged with a prison nearby, giving people cigarettes and candy bars as the actual positive inducements. And what they discovered is the loyalty rate was 30%. Like, this is a fantastically different range, more than twice what it was for grad students. And the disloyalty rate was half, 19%. Completely different expectations. Follow-up research still ongoing to understand why. All we've done is we have an observation point. We might have different models. Maybe the model is that prisoners are all locked up together and therefore much less likely to betray each other over little things. Might be that they recognize that a game like this is played with 3 players, not 2. because the person running the game is a player. They have a resource that they're going to give you based on how you do. So it's important for us to recognize when our models of the world are oversimplifications. And sometimes that's helpful. Now here's a visual way to think about models of the world that are oversimplifications. Some of you may be familiar with these optical illusions. If you look at the one on the left, your brain is probably trying to figure out what it is, unless you've seen it on social media, where it's been very popular lately. It is two concentric circles. Now the human eye can't see that, because you can't look at the whole thing at once. As you look around it though, you can trace two concentric circles. And of course, once you've seen that, you can now file it away as circles in your brain. But until you do that work, your brain would never say this is a pair of circles. But when I say it's concentric circles, that's now a simplification. If I look at the one on the right, you probably see two triangles, except there are no triangles in that picture at all. It's more like a three-way Pac-Man death match about to happen. But nonetheless, the brain simplifies this and sees two overlapping triangles, because we're trying to simplify to make better decisions. And that's all that we do as human beings. We simplify to make faster and better decisions. And sometimes that's easy. For those of you who are not familiar with this automobile, it's the Ford Pinto. Now the Ford Pinto had one simple design flaw. It put the gas tank right in front of that rear bumper. It added weight to the rear tires, made the car easier to handle, also meant that when you got rear-ended, you were more likely than not to crack the gas tank and start leaking petrol all over an accident scene. Not necessarily the most positive of outcomes. Now, I've described it to you, and probably everybody can say, yeah, that sounds like a really bad idea. That's a simple enough to understand. We can try to criticize whichever Ford engineer came up with it. We don't understand why they made that choice, but we can recognize that's a poor choice. But if we fast forward, 25, 30 years in vehicle design, we get to the Jeep Grand Cherokee. A few years ago, there was a lot of press around the stunt hacking done with a hacker taking over somebody's Grand Cherokee at speed and exerting control over some of the vehicle functions. And there's not an obvious simple failure here. The car is connected to the internet, but that's partly because there's a need for parts of the vehicle to connect to the internet, and a need for simplicity to only have one network in the car, and that network combines entertainment functions as well as control functions. And there is some general purpose computers in there and some not general purpose computers. And by the time you start to understand exactly what this risk is, you have to be a complex systems engineer who understands automotive design to try to understand in what way this design was flawed. And that's problematic for human decision making, because the goal of all human decision making is good, fast, cheap decision making. Now, many of you might hear those words, and your immediate reaction is you've heard this good, fast, cheap, pick two, get one. The reality is humans generally do good, fast, cheap decision making. You make decisions all day long. You don't even think about them, they're so cheap. In fact, if I had to pick a thing that humans have optimized for, after the question of are we optimized as persistence runners, how did we get all of our calories, the next thing we optimize for is not thinking, because thinking is expensive, consumes a lot of calories. I wish that would affect my waistline, but it doesn't, but it's fatiguing. So we're trying not to think as much as possible. We try to make decisions through fast pattern matching. And so generally decisions boil down to one of three things. Either we ignore the input, stick our fingers in our ears, it doesn't matter. And that's not we ignore it when we should pay attention. Literally, you're driving your car down the road, cars on the other side of the road, whether they're on your left or on your right, as long as they stay in their lanes, don't matter to us. So we can mostly ignore them. And if there's a barrier, we can ignore them more. Like that's the best feature that barriers have on roads, is they make it cheaper for all of the drivers to think about what they're doing. Or we have to do something and we have a playbook. We can execute on an action we know how to do. Somebody runs out in front of you, you hit the brakes, you veer off to the side. These are things that we know how to do, actions that we have prepared for. The worst thing is when we have to panic. And panic doesn't necessarily mean running around, with our hands in the air screaming. This simply means we have to stop and engage in conscious thought to solve a problem. And that's dangerous for us to do because it spends a lot of calories and it spends a lot of time and it spends a lot of our attention. And so we're going to very quickly try to get out of that world. And some of the ways that we get out of that world aren't very positive. This will be the last time I'll put up this Twitter questionnaire because I very intentionally used the words negative and positive here. Because what I wanted to highlight was that people's reactions actually carried valence for them, emotional weight, right? They had a negative reaction. Why are you doing that? I can't believe you would do that. Oh my goodness, you're stupid for doing that. Whatever it's going to have been, it's a negative, it's a judgmental reaction. In fact, I had a friend summarize this on Facebook recently with this lovely, lovely quote. And he uses an anxiety scale to measure colors, and red is the worst one. And he talks about how when his anxiety is high, it makes him behave less politely to the rest of the world. He uses some language that's a little colorful here, but it's really appropriate. What's going on here is really a fascinating effect. If I'm here and you're there and we're making decisions near one another that sometimes impact one another, what happens is we're interacting with caricatures of each other. I don't see you, I see this vision of you I have in my head that modifies itself based on your input. And what will happen is, as we're interacting, these two pieces come into conflict. And when you take some action that has negative valence for me, I think you're an enemy, you're a bad person. Well, now I get to be the good person. Even if what I'm going to do is use that feeling of goodness, and I'm going to now behave badly back towards you. I'm going to call you names, say negative things towards you, curse in your general direction. You, of course, hear that, and not having this insight that I think I'm doing the right thing, you think I'm being an enemy and I'm being a bad person. And so it makes you feel better about yourself to react badly back in my direction. And it's this cycle in which people will pull themselves farther apart rather than come together to understand what that conflict is, because it's cheap and it's easy to do. Because everyone is ultimately a villain in someone else's story. That's literally what happens. We want to tell a story that we're a hero, and so we tell a story that they are the villain. So to pivot slightly about what's going on here and think about how we learn things. And Gordon, has the stages of learning where you go from unconsciously unskilled to consciously unskilled, right? You don't know enough to even know there's a task, to now you know enough to know there's a task you don't know how to do, to consciously skilled where you're learning the tasks but you have to think about it, to where you're unconsciously skilled where you just execute. And notice that the person who just executes and the person who doesn't even know there's a problem look the same. They're both unconscious of their behaviors. They're just doing them. And in fact, maybe one of them thinks they're in the other one's shoes. This can be either an imposter syndrome or the Dunning-Kruger effect, depending on how you look at it. But those four map to where you spend your energy on the OODA loop. If you're spending all your time in observation, it's likely that you're unconsciously unskilled. You see things but don't know what to do with them, so you don't even process them. So you sort of stop there. Maybe you spend your time in orientation because now you're consciously unskilled. You recognize that there's a problem here, but you don't know what to do about it. Or maybe you're spending your time in decision making because you are consciously skilled, but you still have to think about what you're doing. You have to find your playbook to execute on it. And when you're unconsciously skilled, you get to spend all of your time in action. It's the most efficient place to be. You spend your energy tied to acting. And that can be helpful as long as the actions are the right actions and aren't dangerous actions that lead to bad outcomes. But the problem is if you're unconsciously skilled or unskilled, you're unlikely to be paying attention to the outputs of your actions. You just do and move on. It's only the people who are conscious that will notice that their actions have bad outcomes. And so what we want to do is tie our own observations back into our actions to understand how we're failing. And here's some advice on how to think about doing that. High level, you're going to predict the future so you can detect that you're wrong. And then you have to inspect the past to see how you were wrong. So let's think about how offices might have chosen to close in the era of coronavirus. Many people probably started with authorizing work from home. This was probably that first week around RSA. For those of you who went to that the first week of March in the United States. In other countries it was earlier. In some places it was later. And we tell our staff, you can work from home. We'll put it on you. We'll give you that decision that you're allowed to work from home, even if that's not normal. And then at some point we said, no, everybody should work from home. We're not going to close the office yet. If you have a good reason, you could come into the office, but you probably should still work from home. And then at some point after that, we closed our offices and said, everybody must work from home. Then we realized we're in a period of uncertainty, so we wanted to tell people how long they could work from home. And so maybe we tell them until the 30th of June. Who thought the pandemic would affect us for months instead of weeks? And then when that approached, we've shifted that out, made another decision until September and then December. And then at some point said, let's just go through the next school year, especially as people have year-long apartment leases in a city like Boston with so many college students. Leases go from September to September. So we wanted people to have an opportunity to leave the city potentially if they would rather not pay to be close to an office that they couldn't get in. But notice this is the same set of decisions being made over and over and over again, sometimes based on some new information. But oftentimes when people are making these decisions, the person who's sitting there weighing the pros and cons only looks at what's happening right now. And as they move along this axis, they don't stop and consider to the far back past or the far future. They're looking at making the best possible decision they can make today. And by and large, they're going to do that. But if you'd like to get better about your decision making, two fantastic tools are pre- and post-mortems. And how this works is when you make a decision, and that decision is going to lead to some action on this branch, you're going to go execute on it. As you make the decision, you ask yourself a question. And it actually helps to ask this question in a group and have the most junior person answer first, and work your way up. That way nobody's answer is colored by somebody more senior to them. And the question goes like this. If we were looking back a year from now or 6 months from now and realized that this decision was a failure, in what way was it a failure? Have people predict the worst outcome. And you're starting from an assumption of a bad outcome. So nobody is here saying, oh, I think this is a bad idea. What they're saying is, if it turns out that even if we made the best possible choice, it still turned out badly, how did it turn out badly? Let's cast into the future a tombstone and say, here is how this choice was bad for us. And then as we go forward, we convert from being a decision maker back to being an observer. And we say, did any of those things come true? And even if they didn't lead to a bad outcome, maybe it will tell us how to make better decisions in the future. So we start with a pre-mortem and we end with a post-mortem, even with positive outcomes. Because there's an important thing to remember about positive outcomes is they don't mean you made a good decision. And negative outcomes don't mean you made a bad decision. Sometimes you're making a decision about probabilities in the future and the coin toss doesn't go your way. And that's okay. That just happens. You want to try to mitigate that. So you want to be able to understand through pre and post-mortems, through this observation about your decisions and your actions, whether or not you could have made a better decision with a better process, even if your decision turned out to have worked in your favor. And what's fascinating is as we apply this, we think about failure in the OODA loop as being a failure of action. And it's almost never a failure of action. It's almost always a failure of the model you use to orient yourself to the world. And you'll notice in that previous slide, I used 3 different graphics out of here, none of which was orientation. If you want to improve your skills at observation, you practice observation. If you want to improve your skills at decision, you practice decision making. If you want to improve your skills at action, you practice acting. But if you want to practice your skills at orientation, you can't do that in a vacuum. To improve those skills, you have to observe how your decisions and actions aren't working for you. It takes this whole loop to improve those models. And those models will just improve for you as you notice and observe. That's how the human brain works. We build models. In fact, it's sort of the science behind a lot of the party tricks that are often done in the neurocognitive world. So I'm going to leave you with these. And this is a little bit participatory, which might seem a little odd. I want you to talk out loud. I'm going to ask you questions. Just answer them. And for those of you who can't do that, I understand, try to sub-vocalize. But for those of you, even if you're home alone, like say something right now. Just practice saying some words. And I'm going to ask you a set of questions. And as quickly as possible, I want you to answer these questions. You ready? What color is snow? What color is snow? What color is snow? What color is snow? What do cows drink? Now, a number of you just said milk. And yes, you're going to say baby cows drink milk. But the correct answer is really water. What just happened there? What happened is your brain gets fixated on the color white. And white cow beverage is milk. You don't process the whole sentence because you're trying to act quickly. So your brain very quickly pulled in a model that was white cow beverage, milk is the answer, and executed on it. Now, if this didn't work on you, that's okay. Cognitive tricks like this don't always work on everybody. Everybody has a different brain. In fact, we could do another one based on math. Imagine your friend Taylor buys a baseball glove and a ball for $105. The glove cost $100 more than the ball. What did the ball cost? Many of you said or thought $5. The ball cost $2.50. The glove cost $102.50. Your brain is capable of doing fast decision making and math, and it just connected a couple of dots. It looked for a difference. 105, 100, the difference was 5. And now for the final party trick, we're just going to say 2 words, left or right, depending on where a word appears in relation to this orange line. If it appears on the left side of the line, please say left. If it appears on the right side of the line, please say right. So we begin. Now, many of you got really fast as we went along, and then you got to that 7th word, the left on the wrong side, and you started to say left, or you did say left. Some of you caught yourself, and you slowed down. Your brain was literally training itself. It was observing that this model of the world was not about left-right orientation, but about the words that I had put up. And so you taught yourself, don't bother thinking about left and right, just read the word. And you did that without conscious thought, you didn't engage in it. And that is how the human brain operates. It is continuously looking for ways to improve its models of the world so that it can better orient itself. And if you would like to practice improving that action, what you need to do is look for ways that those models are bad. Look for other people you disagree with and figure out how their model might be helpful to them. Because that will help you better understand ways that you could engage with the same data that they have. So thank you very much for taking the time this morning. I do truly appreciate it, as you've been here with Tactical Edge. So thank you very much, and I believe now we'll be taking some questions.
Yes, Andy, thank you so much, as always. Fascinating. Salma, what do you think?
Really interesting. I learned a lot about making decisions, good decisions. Maybe not being so impulsive, you know, sometimes you don't take the time, enough time to observe, to see what you really need in everything in life, you know. And
it's good.
One decision changed everything.
Absolutely. So, yeah. And you never know which decision it is. If we knew which decision would change everything, we would invest carefully in that one decision.
Exactly.
That's true. That's true. And that ties up with Wendy's presentation yesterday about, you know, with time when she says, think about the future, where you want to be, and then work backwards. Because the decision that we make today may not work. And she gave the example of the fingerprint scanners.
Yes.
Well, what do you do now in COVID where you cannot use the same scanner? Interesting.
Yeah, my favorite piece on that is my wife is the only one in the family that still has Touch ID on her phone. The rest of us went to Face ID. So every time the family's in public for anything and the rest of us are typing in our passcodes, she's like, I have Touch ID. I don't know what you guys are complaining about.
So, and that ties in with Mike Kaiser's presentation on Monday about your identity and privacy, because we're giving away our identity, our face recognition for ease of use and security. But anyway, talking about Wendy, Wendy Nathan, she has a question for you. If everyone is a villain in someone else's story, what does that mean for CISOs? Are they doomed to be the villain? And what can they do about it?
I love that question. Thank you, Wendy. So the hero-villain narrative is baked into how humans operate. You're not going to get rid of it. So the trick is, if somebody thinks they're a hero, you have to figure out how do you write yourself into their hero story. And there aren't a whole lot of hero stories that look like the Avengers or the Justice League, where a group of heroes come together, I was going to say without tension, but both of those are examples of heroes that really fought with one another. If you would like to be an effective CISO, you're a sidekick. CISOs generally don't get anything done. Our job is to enable the business to make better risk choices, which means somebody else is always the hero. We are merely their sidekicks. So when you engage with somebody, recognize they pay your salary. If a product manager comes to you and says, I want to do X, your presumption should be, how can they do X safely? Not, I want to stop them from doing X because it's dangerous. Now, it might be that as part of that conversation, they might come to realize that X is not the right thing to do. They might change, but they're going to go do X with or without you. Very rarely do CISOs have the ability to truly say no. Our best ability is to say, here's how to do it safely. Here's how to understand. More importantly, how to help other people think about risk. Because a subcurrent through everything I said here is most risk choices are not made consciously and they're not quantified. People make them based on their gut feeling about the risk that they know about. So if you separate them from their risk, if they get to come to you and say, here is my project, is it safe? And you're going to go off in a corner and assess it and come back with like 20 findings they don't understand, they don't believe their project's unsafe. If instead you teach them to write down risks, even if it's not as detailed as what you would write, now when they make a decision, they have much more discomfort and uncertainty about the risks that they're inheriting.
Okay, wow, all right. Here's a question. If any chance you can give an example where you or your team use this framework in real time. I'm assuming the framework he's referring to, it's the pre and post.
The pre and post-mortems?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the things we look at in our product launch process, and it's a very uncomfortable conversation, we ask our partners who are launching product, we say, what is your budget for incidents? How often is there going to be an incident when you launch this? And they really worry that we ask that question as a gotcha. We're going to say, oh, you're not allowed to have 12 incidents next year. And it's really the opposite. If you're launching a new product and you don't plan to have incidents, that means you're not actually thinking about the future. Like, I want to understand what are your most likely incidents so that we can write them down and prepare for them. Because not all incidents need to be mitigated in advance. If the incident is we're launching a brand new product and if it takes off too much, we're going to have performance problems because our capacity plan isn't designed for more than 3 customers in the first 6 months. Great, write that down. When we get to 5 customers, we're all just going to prepare for an incident that's going to be a capacity related one. That's not a problem. In fact, that's really a success when you think about it. And so we'll often use that, and then we tie that back to future incidents. When we have an incident, we say, is this one we had predicted? And if it's a bad incident and we didn't predict it, what did we miss? Why didn't we have this on our list of possible dangerous outcomes?
Okay, Wendy, as always, maybe not call it a pre-mortem or post-mortem in this age of COVID-19.
Yeah, I did recognize that. Unfortunately, those are terms of art. So the pre-mortem concept comes out of Gary Klein's work, the author of Sources of Power. He's sort of given it away because he can't find a way to monetize it, so he's working on other decision-making things in his consulting practice. And I think we're all familiar with post-mortems.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I would love a better term for it, but it's a term of art that I think everybody understands.
Okay. So one of the statements that you had, well, you showed that statement in Facebook that it made that again, going with the villain thing.
Yep.
Do we see that based on our own experiences? Because you mentioned before with the thing about the monkeys and everything. I mean, is a lot of that stuff based on our own experience?
So some of it's based on our own experience, some of it's based on natural. Look, I'll give you an example, Edgar. You know, the Patriots are the greatest dynasty in the history of football. Like your immediate reaction as a Steelers fan is to like go, no, there aren't. Like
I laugh.
You laughed because you knew that was sort of coming. But like we can be friendly about it. And football is weird. American football specifically, because it's one of the few places that people don't hate each other because they just have different fandoms. Whereas football in other parts of the world tends to be, a little more, violent between fan bases. So, I think what happens here is it's natural for us. And now I've said this thing that you disagree with. So the next thing that I say, your first reaction is going to be, well, I also disagree with that because Andy is not part of my tribe.
Okay.
Right? And so we see that on Facebook, on social media, that how many people's policy positions, at least that they talk about, are really in opposition to somebody else rather than derived from their own first principles. Exactly. You say, oh, they're bad, therefore anything they say is bad, therefore I'm opposed to it, and that must be good without further inspection.
All right, great. And so what do you think about so Akamai, it seems like you guys were ready for something like the COVID pandemic.
Absolutely. We would do every year, we have remote work days. We pivoted our entire network over the last 10 years to be a zero trust model where my experience on my laptop is the same no matter where I am on the planet. Our new headquarters, which is sitting empty at the moment, was designed as a giant Starbucks. There's a barista and there's a Wi-Fi network. You could walk in and you're on the same network that I'm on, because all of my applications verify me. So when we told people to work from home, we didn't have a VPN provisioning problem. We didn't have to think about a changing security model. We were already living in that world. We had been prepared for that for over the last 10 years.
Wow. That's impressive. Probably one of the very few companies in the planet.
Yeah. Now I'll be honest, we were not actually prepared mentally for
nobody was.
how long it's been and going on, but no, for us, this has actually been, as a company, seamless. I don't want to downplay how much pain and harm has been suffered by our staff members who are working in really crisis situations, that they have small children or roommates and they don't have the ability to work from home. So I don't want to minimize that when I say the company was ready, because I recognize that a company is a collection of humans, not all of whom were privileged and advantaged enough to compensate easily.
Well, again, Andy, that was fantastic. I tell you, Salma, every time I hear Andy speak, it's like, what?
Yeah, amazing presentation, really. Andy, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And